Well, good evening, everybody. The live stream has started. This is a licensing subcommittee meeting in connection with a licensing application for a new premises licence under Section 17 of the Licensing Act 2003. The applicant is Epic Bars Nuneaton Limited. Can I just take an applicant representative name, please, for the record? Sorry, could you use your microphone, please?
Good evening, my name is Andrew Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. And there is an interested party. Who is representing the interested party, please?
There we go. I break things. I'll warn you now. My name is Sarah Clover, and I'm the barrister on behalf of Stonegate.
Thank you. Now, the first item on the agenda will be the election of chair. So could I invite nominations, please, from the panel?
I'll nominate Councillor Clark, Director Richardson.
And is there a seconder?
Yes, I'm happy to second that.
Councillor Clark, you are duly nominated and seconded, and there being no other person who can be, you are duly elected as chair.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Right, welcome everyone to the hearing, subcommittee hearing for licensing subcommittee in relation to licensing new premises licence for Trilogy of 4244 Nuneaton Street, Nuneaton. We're here to consider the matter, the application, and we will follow a set procedure, and I've just got to find it again. Right, so first of all, last for declarations of interest that are not already declared on the papers.
No.
None from members. Thank you. The meeting is quorate. Introductions. Councillor Jeff Clark. I represent St Nicholas Ward in Nuneaton, and I'll be chairing the meeting today. Councillor Croft is a member for Galley Common, and Councillor Mandy Tromans is also a member for Galley Common, so they've got, yes, you're well represented today. Thank you. Right, I'll remind parties that you've got a right to address and present evidence to the subcommittee, and if permitted to question other parties if permitted. So I'll take that under advisement as and when if necessary. I'll ask the legal advisor to confirm the notice of the hearing's been properly given.
I'm just looking at Julianne, Chair, and if she gives me the nod, I will confirm. Yes, Chair, they have.
Been duly served, thank you. Has there been any notice of withdrawal or representation received from anyone? No, none received.
Chair, there haven't been any withdrawals. No.
Further extension of time, German tour edition, that's for later. Ask for any further documentary evidence. I know we've had additional documentary evidence which members have all had sight of, and I presume the applicant and obviously you've served that, so that's duly served.
Can I just clarify? Yes, Chair. If I can just for the record, just clarify that we do have witness statements from the applicant, Jimmy Elias, and in addition, an email from Mr. Woods dated the 4th of March, together with a copy of a plan and various other plans related to the operational statement of the premises, which is in the binder that you have. It's in the plastic binder that you have. And then on behalf of Stonegate, we have a statement on behalf of Stonegate together with a pack of photographic exhibits, which I assume Ms Glover will take us through in due course. I think, Chair, those are the documents that have been submitted in connection with this appeal.
Thank you. Members of the committee have had sight of those. Just confirm that the applicant has had sight also.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right. The procedure then, members will have been, or applicants and objectors have been notified of the procedure, I presume, have you? You all had sight of that. The applicant will outline their case first, and then the subcommittee can ask questions or seek clarification at that point in relation to the application. There will, any responsible authority as well is also permitted to ask questions. And any interested parties to the proceedings, obviously yourselves, will also have that opportunity. I will then call for the evidence in support of the application. Obviously we've had that information, so we'll move on as per order of speeches. So I'll ask, sorry, is it Mr. Wood? Mr. Woods. Mr. Woods then to outline the application before us this evening in relation to Trilogy. Thank you.
Thank you, councillors. I've looked at the order of speeches, and if it's all right with you, I propose to wrap up outlining the case and explaining our evidence in one go, rather than calling a witness as such. I'll address you on the application and the main points. Mr. Elias Jimmy is the Managing Director of EPIC. My instructions come from Mr. Elias. He is here and can answer any questions that either you or the interested parties have of him that is relevant to the application. And I'm sure if I say anything wrong, I'll get an elbow in the ribs and Mr. Elias will set me straight. So I'm just going to steam on, if that's all right with you, and present the case.
Yeah, the members of the committee are happy with that process and that procedure, thank you.
And to avoid repeating information that you've already seen, the outline of the application, the hours which are sought, and the details of the application are contained in page 2 of the papers that you have, as well as the full application form at page 11. The opening hours are set out both on page 2 and at page 11. And you may have seen in the application form itself that there were 24 conditions which were offered by the applicant with the original application, and they start on page 24. The prevention of crime and disorder, public safety, the prevention of nuisance, and the protection of children from harm. So in making this application, they were the 24 conditions proposed initially, and they're all contained within the application. I'm not going to go through all of those in detail, but they deal with everything that I think you would expect us to deal with, including SIA, dispersal policy, search policy, CCTV, incident logs, notices to leave quietly, challenge 25, and staff training. And obviously, if you have any questions on those, Mr. Elias is here. The initial application was processed in the way that you would expect it to be processed, and Julianne has confirmed that. There was a public notice placed on the building, which actually is still on the building now. There was a notice placed in the newspaper, and there were notices on the building for residents to raise objections if appropriate. And all of the responsible authorities were served with this application that is within your pack. And you will have noted, I'm sure, from the committee papers that you have and from the absence of any responsible authorities in this room, that none of the responsible authorities have made a single representation about this application. So the police are entirely happy that the licensing objectives are promoted. They don't make a representation. environmental health are happy in terms of promoting the licensing objective public nuisance. Your licensing department are happy, and no residents have made any representations against this application. There is one objection to this application, as you will have seen in your papers. This comes from a competing nightclub. It comes from a nightclub called Fever, which, as you may know, is situated directly above the proposed site for Trilogy. Fever is owned by Stonegate. They also own and operate Pop World in Nuneaton. They also own and operate Silk Mill in Nuneaton. And they are the only objectors to this application. To assist the committee in assessing the application that Mr. Elias has put in, could I just give you some background information which is contained within his statement on the building itself? As you may remember, this was a former supermarket that served the centre of Nuneaton. It is a site which is extremely well known to Mr. Elias, because as you may have picked up from the papers, Mr. Elias used to run the Fever premises, which are now owned and operated by Stonegate, who object to this application. And Mr. Elias traded those premises in his previous company between 2011 to 2019. So Mr. Elias understands the workings of that building, the workings of Nuneaton extremely well, and I would ask you to attach significant weight to that in assessing the evidence that Mr. Elias gives through me. Whilst trading Fever on the first floor, whilst Mr. Elias was trading it, not Stonegate, there was a nightclub operating beneath them called Velvet, and if you walk past the building now, you can still see the Velvet signs on the doors. And those premises traded alongside Fever, so Fever on the first floor, Velvet on the ground floor, for about 5 or 6 years. They were operated by an independent company. Mr. Elias and the independent company worked together on all issues in terms of the licensing objectives, and in particular in certain of the criteria which is raised by Stonegate and dispersal and queues and such like that. Everybody worked together to sort it out and ensure that the best solution was reached. And there was also a third premises, which was originally Wetherspoons, then became Beer Keller, and is now Silk Mill, that is still operating, and that's currently owned by Stonegate. So again, in assessing the evidence, you can attach weight to the fact that this building has had 3 licenses in it before. The police, environmental health are well aware that there have been 3 licenses in it before. They will have looked and been aware of the data, if there is any, or statistics, and aware of the 3 licenses that have operated before. They still don't make any objection to the application. So it's not just a case of us coming in and saying, we'd like to operate on the ground floor, here's what we're going to do, that will promote the licensing objectives. It's not just that, it is also the fact that we have experience and evidence, as do your police force and environmental health departments, in assessing how those premises have run in the past. Mr. Elias is the applicant. I've dealt with his experience in the town. He's also a very experienced late night operator generally. Both him and his senior management team have been in the industry since the 90s. They invest their own money in businesses. There's no third-party investments as such, so it's their money that they're putting into Nuneaton to try and open their business. And in doing this, they will spend approximately £400,000 on getting the premises up and running, refurbing the premises and taking the premises on. They expect to employ 40 to 50 people, a mixture of part-time and full-time. And when they were previously in Nuneaton, they would regularly meet of their own volition with the police. It was a lady then called Carleen Sims. They used to meet with Carleen every month and discuss how the town was working. I think, to be fair, the town was busier pre-pandemic when Mr. Elias was operating here previously, but obviously we're hopeful that the nighttime economy will come back with these premises open. There used to be a Barracuda opposite as well, which I think has closed down, and one or two of the premises nearby. But Mr. Elias will have an experienced management team running those premises, with him guiding the manager and working with the police, and there is a track record of that. When we were told the police weren't going to object to the application, but when we received the Stonegate objection, I sent it to the police and said, here are some concerns which are being expressed by a competitor. Do you have any concerns or anything that you want to discuss as a result of that? And we had a discussion about where we would like to queue and how we would work with the operator, how we would join pub watch, that we wouldn't have any under 18s in. The police said we're a bit worried about what your plans are with regard to children, so we propose that we'll have no under 18s in the premises. We proposed a last entry time, and we agreed to send the police policies relating to searching and dispersal and agree them with the police prior to opening. So Mr. Elias has opened many premises. He has a dispersal policy, but when he takes over a building, he'll work on that building. He'll go and see the police, and it will be fine-tuned, and it will be agreed with the police and the licensing authority. And we're more than happy that that is a condition on the licence, that those policies are agreed. Having received the objection, we submitted some 3D plans to show where the fire escapes and the entrances were. We submitted a brief operational statement just to explain how the building would work in terms of customer flow. That is something which hopefully assists the committee in understanding how it works. We will also have a full operating manual that generally runs to about 60-70 pages, which deals with in detail how the premises operate. And that will cover things such as terms of entry, dress code, intoxication, guest welfare, queues, searches, dispersal, crime scene management, everything that you would expect to have in place. And again, that will be shared with Warwickshire Police and discussed with them, and any comments from Warwickshire Police will be taken on board. Mr. Elias, we also have a dedicated customer care person who has a red T-shirt on called Here to Help, and that's a fairly recent initiative in the last couple of years. That person's sole job is to keep an eye on all of the customers, not to take part in being the door staff, not to manage the premises, but to, in effect, be a social welfare officer for the company. So looks for people who are starting to show signs of having a bit too much to drink, looks for lone male or female who may need some assistance, and that's their role. So that's something that is put into every business that Mr. Elias operates now. He's operated in over 20 local authority areas, very keen to work in partnership with the authorities. We'll work in partnership with other operators as well to make sure that the licensing objectives are promoted. And of course, as you will have picked up from the papers, used to operate Fever, and in January 2019, Stonegate purchased 32 premises that Mr. Elias and his partners were operating, and that's why Stonegate now operates those premises, and that was completed around January 2019, and one of those purchased was Fever Nuneaton. And since receiving the letter and some of the concerns that have been expressed, we've had a specific conversation with Warwickshire Fire Department. I know fire isn't necessarily a licensing objective, but public safety is. And we've discussed the proposed fire exits at the back leading into the car park, and there are no issues there. And we've had further conversations with Peter Oakley at Warwickshire Police to ensure that everything is dealt with. So that in normal circumstances would be the application that I would present to the committee. The experience that Mr Elias has both in Nuneaton and in that particular building, the liaison with all of the authorities, the extra conditions that have been proposed and agreed, and I would be suggesting that quite clearly they promote the licensing objectives. Of course, in this case, we have an objection letter from another operator. And what I'm more than happy to do, because the committee has to be satisfied that we promote the licensing objectives as is set out in your papers and in your policy. I'm more than happy to deal with every point that's raised in that, and for you to ask Mr Elias any questions on some of those points that is raised. You will, I'm sure, forgive me for saying that in my respectful submission, it's a trade protection objection. They want to protect their trade in Nuneaton. They don't want us to come in, and that's the rationale behind the letter. The letter, of course, is extremely well written and refers to the licensing objectives, so I fully accept it's quite proper that you deal with them, and having been accepted quite properly, it's only right that I deal with those concerns that have been made. But it's interesting in your papers, it talks about the committee assessing the facts and the evidence that have been submitted to you. I would ask you to attach significant weight to Mr Elias's experience in the building and the Nuneaton, and to ask, and you obviously will not need to make a decision on this, the rationale behind this objection, which I suggest is to prevent competition and to protect their trade. But they're issues which I deal with one by one. I don't need to take too long on this. Their client has real concerns about this application. We say those concerns are dealt with all through the conditions, through the liaison with the authorities, and the authorities don't share those concerns that Stonegate share. There's reference to cumulative impact zones, which, as you will know, you don't have one. Of course, you can always consider any application and whether you think that will add to issues. But in this particular case, you're not presented with any facts or statistics, particularly by the police, to suggest that that would be a reason not to grant this application. Quite clearly, you would look to the police to say, well, actually, there's been a real increase in crime and disorder, or there's concerns about this, and we think another one might just be too much. Although Stonegate asked you throw that into the mix for you to consider, that there's nothing in the representation that supports that suggestion. Queuing is a very fair point to raise, because we've got the two premises together. In discussions with the police, and you will, I'm sure, picture the building where the silk mill is on the right. There's an entrance to Fever, then there'll be the entrance to to Trilogy. Then at the end there is a VIP entrance to Fever. I understand that hasn't been used since after the pandemic. It may well have been used occasionally. It's not used often, but it's something that we need to take into account that is there. So when we discussed it with the police, our preference, of course, would be that we queue to the left. As you look in the photographs, you will have seen that the Fever queue goes there in that place as well. You know, we will have to work with Fever to obtain the best solution for where the queues go. Wherever the queue goes, any fire escape, any exit or entrance will be kept absolutely clear through the door staff, through management, through the use of bollards, through the use of railings. There will be, you can be completely satisfied that no queue will cover a fire escape. I mean, if it did, Mr Elias, or conversely the directors of Stonegate, if it was them, would be up before the criminal courts, because you're not allowed to do that. So that simply will not happen. We are more than happy to work with Stonegate as to what the best queuing situation is. We worked, when we were in their position, with the operators of Velvet to ensure that queuing was sorted out, and that will be a matter that we are happy to work with them and discuss with them. I have to say we operate, as I know Stonegate do, in many towns where premises are close to each other, and operators working together and promoting the objectives ensures that that generally isn't an issue. You don't get arguments over, well, I want to queue there and I want to queue there. It will be resolved. Dispersal is raised. We'll have a full dispersal policy. We'll agree that with the police. Mr. Elias will meet with the police. That can be a condition. If there's anything in the dispersal policy the police are not happy with, then we will amend it and work with the police. Interestingly, further down the representation, they refer to fast food takeaways and concerns about there's a limited number of fast food takeaways. When Mr. Elias previously operated in Nuneaton in Fever, they would put on hot dogs, bottles of water for customers if it was found to be a problem. If customers are saying, we want some food and we can't get any, rather than let them loiter around the town and cause problems, we would try and solve the problems by having a very basic, I'm not trying to suggest for 1 minute we're providing the best food that they can get, but it's something for customers to eat if they want to. And we also have given out bottles of water to customers as they are leaving, giving them water. Obviously water is a good thing to have at that time of night, but as they're drinking it, it also ensures that they're quiet. So these are all initiatives that we would put into these premises if appropriate, and certainly in discussions with the police. Taxi ranks, we'll hold customers. There is a taxi rank opposite. I know that Mr. Elias has been to look at the taxi ranks and taxis in the area. You know, if there is a problem, we will hold customers and we'll call taxis for them. And I think when I was walking around the town earlier with Mr. Elias, he said taxis come to where there is business. There might not be a great deal of taxis at the moment, but compared to 2 or 3 years ago, the amount of activity in the late night economy is not as good as it used to be. So we're very confident that once, with your permission, another club opens and the nighttime economy takes off a bit more, the taxis will come back. If it's a problem, we'll hold customers, we'll find a local firm and we'll reach agreements. Residential premises, we've had no objections from any residents to this application. Means of escape, all agreed with the fire officer. Protection of children is raised. We'll have no under 18s. Capacity to be finalised when the final fire risk assessment is carried out, likely to be in the region of 800, but to be finalised in the end, but the question is asked about capacity, so that's the answer. I can't see it being a great deal more than that. I think 800 is about where it will be. The smoking area is a self-contained area that Velvet used at the side. We just went to have a look at it. It's got 8-foot wooden fence around it. You can only access it from inside what will be Trilogy, and you can't get from the smoking area back to out into the car park at the back. There's some reference in the Stonegate statement about issues with the smoking area previously. I think Mr. Elias and his team moved it from the back of the premises when they were operating Fever to on the first floor because it was a much better solution. They didn't have a self-contained area at the back. They were using barriers at the back to make a smoking area, and it wasn't working particularly well. So it was their decision to move it to the first floor, which I think, and I haven't been in when it's been trading, is where Fever still have it now. Last entry is referred to, and we've agreed to 3:30 with the police. And I think that those are generally the main concerns that have been expressed. So those are Mr. Elias's responses to those concerns. He's more than happy. He knows the building backwards. He knows Nuneaton very well. He knows his business. He's more than happy to answer any questions that may have. The final operational manual will be finalised if a licence is granted when the work is started on the building, and we'll work with the police on all of the matters that I referred to. and we'll agree that with the police and with the licensing authority. That's fairly standard procedure when taking on a new building, and all of the matters contained in the manual and in the proposed conditions are there to promote the licensing objectives based on Mr. Elias's understanding of the building and Nuneaton, and that's why they're proposed. So hopefully that is not just an outline but explains the application. Perhaps Mr. Elias could just confirm, as he is here with me, that whether everything I've said is correct.
Yes. Correct.
Yes, if you could just confirm that, Mr. Elias, that everything that's been detailed is correct as detailed.
Yes, I confirm everything that Mr. Wood said is correct.
So, thank you, councillors. That is the outline of the application and the evidence as such that I would call on behalf of Mr. Elias.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. Thank you, Mr. Elias. Just a couple of clarification points from members first before we open it up. Just in relation, you mentioned the various parties that have objected. Obviously, the licensing committee have come to a subcommittee for consideration, so there is a consideration to be had there. So that's why we're here tonight, just to outline. It's not going through just straight through the licensing panel.
Sorry, if that's what it sounded like, it never meant. My point was that the responsible authorities haven't objected to the application, but I also agree that because you have a valid representation, it is a matter for you to decide, and therefore that's why I went through every point made, because you will have to decide if you accept the evidence that Mr. Elias gives. So yes, apologies if that wasn't going across.
That's fine. I'm just going to clarify, members, if there are any questions at this point of yourselves. And officers, have you got any comment at this point? Right. I have got a couple of questions myself before I go to the objector, and they may want to cross-examine at some point, I understand. But I've got a couple of questions. You mentioned food and the fact that you've provided hot snacks, shall we say. That's probably the best way of thinking. Does the facility have kitchen facilities there?
I didn't want to overplay the food bit, because the food isn't prepared at any great length in a kitchen. It's a machine that you can buy, and it makes hot dogs. So it's just if there's a problem, if it's just something to give customers. We often find that if customers are eating or drinking something when they're leaving, it helps them be quiet, and it actually helps the dispersal. It's not something that we would say is anything fantastic. It's just something that's provided.
Thank you for that. And I need another point clarifying, but I think the officers may be able to clarify this for me. You mentioned taxi ranks. Can you just, the officers, clarify that there is a part-time taxi rank overnight there? Is that was my understanding originally. I don't know whether that's still the case.
There was a temporary taxi rank put in 2014, but that was paid for by the Crime Commission. It was only a sort of test system which worked reasonably well, but then the numbers of people that were using it actually dwindled and dwindled, so therefore it was stopped. The taxis still use that rank, and it isn't a permanent rank, it's only a temporary rank. It's not an official rank as such. But they still use it. We did have problems with taxis queuing up outside the nightclubs, which is why we put it in the first place. But it isn't technically an official rank.
Right, I'm a little bit confused there. You say it's not an official rank. My understanding, when, as you mentioned, it was put in originally 2014, it was a part-time rank rather than a temporary one. It's a part-time, i.e. overnight, or for the times when these clubs are open.
The rank was put in as a trial with the county council and the local authority, and it was decided that we would not make it a permanent taxi rank, because then we'd have to mark up the rank itself. That continued for 2 years, and the county were quite happy for it to stay, but it never became a permanent rank. It was only ever a temporary rank.
think that's all the questions I...
Chair, I don't have any questions for the applicant. I do have a representation to present to you based upon the documents that we've submitted.
Thank you. We're happy to hear those and that representation. It's over to yourselves. Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
It's Sarah Clover, like four leaf.
I did get it. I do apologise. Sorry, Sarah, Miss Clover.
Sorry. Thank you, Chair. It's disappointing to have this presented to you by the applicant as a trade or a competitive objection, because I think it's pretty clear on the face of it that it's not. It's disappointing that the licensed applicant is not actually engaging with the points that have been made on behalf of Stonegate and are not accepting what's being said, although I did notice Mr. Woods say that queuing was a good point. It's more than a good point, it's absolutely crucial, and there are a number of things that are absolutely crucial about this application that I hope, as I explain a little bit more, will give the subcommittee some pause for consideration and concern. I've got Lauren Kelsall with me, who is the General Manager of Fever. I was hoping also to have the Area Manager, Mr. Cave, with me. He's suffered a personal family crisis and unfortunately can't be with us. But I've had meetings with these people within Stonegate, and they've explained the nature of their concerns to me. If this were a competitor objection only, the council would not have accepted it because that is not a permissible ground for objection to a licence. Stonegate is an experienced national operator of some substance, as you will be aware, and that's set out in the papers before you. And the application that's been put in on behalf of Epic Bars is not inspiring confidence in any way, shape or form. And Mr. Elias has not inspired confidence in terms of his commitment to various operations. And he has put in his statement his various transactions with Stonegate and the due diligence that Stonegate have had cause to do on Epic Bars, and you will see some of that due diligence reflected back in the written submissions that were put in just before this hearing, and in relation to the walking away of a number of premises around the country when clientele have become problematic. And so there are some up close and personal concerns that Stonegate have with this particular operator and their experience of Epic Bars, but also anyone that might try to operate what was Velvet and is now to be Trilogy in such close proximity to the existing premises, because things have changed. It's not the way it was when Mr. Elias was running Velvet. Both of these premises are bigger. And one of the key considerations to take into account is that the premises that Stonegate are now running as Fever have undergone some significant refurbishment to the extent of extending the main room area. They have opened up the roof to create a smoking terrace because of the difficulties that were being experienced with the outdoor smoking terrace previously, that caused the engagement of environmental health services and were causing noise nuisance issues that it was felt could not be resolved by any intervention with the outdoor space at all. And so they have gone to that level of expense to create a bespoke roof terrace for smoking. It's very concerning to hear that Mr. Elias, through Mr. Woods, doesn't understand how the VIP entrance works for Fever. The VIP entrance that you've just heard essentially written off as not used or rarely used is actually now an essential access and egress point and a fire exit for Fever as a result of their increased capacity as a result of their refurbishment in 2019. And not to know that by Mr. Elias is just one of many concerns. Now, we haven't seen EPIC's full operational management document or book or whatever it is they call it, the 60-page document, and I don't know why, because we've clearly asked for it. Now, what Mr. Elias and Epic Bars have said, and they've repeated it again in the statement, is we don't know why, EPIC don't know why Stonegate didn't approach us. Well, that's the wrong way round. If you're opening new premises in a town centre that have already got extant premises, you would go to them and say, we're planning to open next to you. We've got a slightly unusual situation. We share a building. We're going to be sharing a queuing area. We're going to be sharing resources and potential flashpoints. Shall we have a chat before we put our application in? And the first Stonegate knew about this application was when the notices went up. And at no point has Mr. Elias or anyone from EPIC formally approached anyone in Stonegate to say, can we discuss this? And when Stonegate put their representation in, and you'll have two documents essentially in front of you with the nature of Stonegate's concerns, the original representation document and then the written submissions that came in the other day, when Stonegate put in their first representation, it was replete with comments like, we don't know how the queuing's going to work. We don't know how the dispersal's going to work. We don't know how this is going to impact on our access points and egress points. We don't really understand how Mr. Elias's operation is going to happen. And instead of at that point disclosing the operation management document to us so we can actually work through it and see, the other points that Stonegate made were about noise, based on their experience and the problems that they'd had. Obviously, they knew where the residential was and so forth, and what the nature of the environmental health officer's concerns were at the time. None of that has been disclosed. And what came back was Mr. Elias's statement saying, well, I don't know why Stonegate didn't talk to us, and this short 3 or 4 page operation document, which doesn't contain any details of queuing, and it doesn't contain any details of dispersal, and it doesn't contain any details about noise. It doesn't really contain a great deal at all. And it's also to be noted that when EPIC are saying to you, when the applicant is saying to you, we will disclose our big operational document to the responsible authorities, at no time have they said, notwithstanding Stonegate's concerns, and we'll share it with Stonegate as well. That's a huge concern. And there's no reason for it. Stonegate are not setting their face against partnership working, but this isn't an example of how it works. Mr. Elias has said in his statement, I bumped into Mr. Cave on the street and I bumped into Sarah on the street and they said it would be all right. That isn't how formal partnership working to get two premises to work cooperatively together should happen. And it's not Stonegate's responsibility to do it. This is the applicant's responsibility to do it. So this is not a very good start at all. I have no clue as to why Mr. Elias essentially is declining to share with you or with Stonegate the 60-page document upon which he says he's going to rely. Now, whether that is because, and I'm speculating, but whether that is because it is a generic document and it has yet to be nuanced to take into account precisely what goes on with Velvet and Trilogy as it now is, I don't know, but it's an absolutely fundamental step. Now, Fever's VIP exit is more than that, as I've indicated. It is a fundamental fire exit that the fire service required to service the higher capacity that has gone with the 2019 refurbishment. So it's absolutely crucial. We cannot understand, Stonegate cannot understand, looking at the photographs, looking at the plans, looking at anything that's emanated from EPIC, how it is going to be possible to accommodate 2 queues and not impinge upon that door, either for general use as the VIP entrance and exit or as a fire exit. And we cannot understand how it will be possible to manage that queue. Now, in response to that, Epic may turn around and say, well, there were always 2 queues for Velvet and Fever, and that may be right. I don't know how effective they were or whether they ever caused any problems. I'm sure members will have an idea better than mine as to whether there have ever been any issues in Nuneaton Town Centre associated with the nightlife, whether there's ever been any crime and disorder or antisocial behaviour. It would be something close to a miracle if there never was. But however that was managed then is by the by, because we have a new situation now, and you will be able to see from the photographs how Fever's queue works, I hope, and if you want any further information on that, I'm sure Ms Kelsall can assist. But the single line in Mr Elias's statement is, I will ensure that there is always a gap. Well, I don't know what that looks like in real terms. I don't know how that is actually implementable in real terms, that there will always be a gap, because people behave in the way that people behave, and short of constant monitoring to make sure what queue members are doing and where they're standing, that is a promise that would be very, very difficult to maintain. It is encouraging to know that the police and the responsible authorities do not currently have any concerns about the crime and disorder element within Nuneaton Town Centre, and that's encouraging to hear. But I understand that the police officer, Peter Oakley, is relatively new in post, which may well mean that he doesn't have personal historical experience of Nuneaton, how Nuneaton works, how these 2 nightclubs used to work, and what might be expected going forwards. Now, if he has interrogated the police licence and computer systems in recent times to see what kind of crime and disorder picture there may be in Nuneaton Town Centre, he will have seen a rosy picture, of course, because everything's been closed. And that would not be a good basis upon which to judge the general levels of antisocial behaviour that might be expected in Nuneaton Town Centre, not least off the back of the 2 historical clubs, but off the back of these 2 new ones, which are both bigger. And that would be a false confidence. As Stonegate are very experienced, and they're experienced in Nuneaton as of 2019, and they're experienced nationally. And what you will need to understand, which you may or may not already understand, is that the demographic within nighttime economies post-pandemic is a very different thing. Prior to the pandemic, nighttime economies had a certain flow within their respective town and city centres. When the COVID lockdowns came, there was a certain, well, everybody went back to their respective homes, of course they did. After lockdowns ended and people were permitted to come out again, the demographic changed quite significantly. There was a significant proportion of people who were still very nervous about coming out. To a large extent, there were age differentials built into that split. Nationally, we saw a phenomenon where one might describe them as being the slightly more carefree, dare I say maverick contingent was willing to come out first, and the more cautious demographic was not. There has been a very changed atmosphere on our town and city streets post-pandemic. You may have picked up on some of this. Sexual assaults nationally, for example, have gone exponential. Drug dealing, the dealers in their market could not wait to meet with each other in person again. And you may also have come across the phenomenon of spiking. Now these are national issues that have been associated in ways that we do not yet completely understand with this release from lockdown. And for any responsible authority, for any licensing operator to operate effectively in this post-pandemic environment, those sorts of issues need to be understood very clearly, and Stonegate does. And that also informs the level of its concern about these new premises opening up in this way without the necessary diligence, without the necessary scrutiny going into the management of that operation. Got no indication from any of the paperwork that Epic Bars have liaised in any way with environmental health. Now, environmental health haven't made a representation, that is true, but there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that they were significantly engaged with Fever's smoking area, as I have previously touched upon. Now, the nature of the problems that were experienced with Fever's outdoor smoking area were such that Fever felt, that Stonegate felt when they came in, could not be resolved outdoors. It is very difficult to imagine how it could be that Trilogy will have an outdoor smoking area in similar circumstances and in a relatively similar position that would not give rise to the same sorts of issues that were arising with Fever's operation. And that doesn't seem to have been addressed in any way, shape or form. That is not speculative. It is not simply a question of saying local residents will not be disturbed, people will not cause antisocial behaviour in the outdoor areas. They always did. One of the key concerns was people trying to get into premises through the back area, sneaking in when they couldn't get in through the front area. It was a very difficult thing to manage. Something, again, that Ms Kelsall could comment on if you required further details. But these sorts of issues have to be managed very carefully, and to have absolute silence in the application upon such points simply isn't good enough. The queuing and the dispersal really probably comprises the fundamental issues here. That's the must-have. And I'll give you an example. If you have 2 lots of queuing and you have 2 lots of SIA security staff and something kicks off, if you have an incident outside the front of the club, for example, you have a mass brawl, which is by no means unknown, regrettable though it is. I don't understand it to have been a major problem in Nuneaton, but these are the sorts of things that happen. CCTV will pick up an incident like that, and it will pick up who is door staff, and it will pick up who is patron. And when you're trying to unravel that and say, well, where did they come from, these drunken people? Was it Fever or was it Trilogy? A doorman throws a punch, let's say. Was it a Fever doorman? Was it a Trilogy doorman? Do they have different identification apparel? Do they have an armband? Do they have a vest top? What is it that they've got? Can you tell the difference? These sorts of things are absolutely vital, and for reasons that you can very easily imagine. There's been no attempt to deal with anything of that sort. It can't be discounted and sorted out for later. What I'm hearing from the application on paper and from the other side of the room today is we will sort it out. It will be discussed. We will find a route through it if there are problems with the taxis, with food, with takeaways, with this, with that. If there's a problem, we will sort it out. That isn't how licensing works. Your responsibility and your test is the promotion of the prevention of. It's a zero tolerance test. Your remit is to prevent these things from occurring. You don't have a requirement to allow things to pan out and see how it goes and perhaps have some incidents and then say, well, that's now what could go wrong, and now we're going to step in and do something about it. When you have cogent material in front of you, cogent representations as to the very likely things that could go wrong, you are perfectly entitled, even on a new application where nothing's happened so far, to take steps that you understand will prevent it. And that is essentially why Stonegate are here. Now, to wrap this up, you will see from the second statement that Stonegate put in, and I do invite you to read the written representations rather than me going through them line by line, but they are all there to be presented to you. And what Stonegate are asking for is an element of caution here. Firstly, in respect of capacity. Having increased the capacity of Fever, it is now inappropriate to do the same without close consideration for Trilogy. I don't know where we see it set out actually what the actual capacity is. I think we've got different capacities for different rooms. That potentially is going to cause tension if some areas within Trilogy prove to be more popular than others. That's something that would need very careful management. But in any event, it makes sense to maintain the overall capacity of these premises, at least initially, to something such as it always was, to try and get back that balance and to try and get back that partnership working to a level of cooperation before the parameters and the boundaries are pushed, shall we say. The next thing to curtail at this stage is hours. Now, I say this advisedly because it is always going to be possible for Epic Bars to come back with a variation application to extend. That's not a particularly onerous thing to do. What that then allows is to give an opportunity to see how these premises will bed in together, to give the opportunity that for whatever reason Epic have not taken to date to come to Stonegate, disclose their detailed management proposals, to have those under close discussion and to work out a plan together. This would allow for that opportunity. You may even wish to allow a lead-in period before this licence actually commences to facilitate something of that sort. But in terms of hours, this is important. Both of the premises have a last entry hour. Now, the last entry hour that Fever operates to, and I think it's actually more conservative than their licence would permit, but this is what their experience has decreed is successful. Their last entry time is 2 o'clock. And so if you were to make the closing time at this point in time of Trilogy 2 o'clock, what you would then have is a diluted dispersal, because you would have no more intake for Fever based upon their operating plan, the way they operate things. So you would have no more people turning up from 2 o'clock onwards, and then from 2 o'clock onwards you would have the dispersal from Trilogy, and you would actually dilute the clash of those people, and you would actually avoid the dispersal ploughing into the queue to get into Fever, and that would be an effective methodology for getting these premises to operate cooperatively together. I'd be happy to go through the photographs with you. I'm not going to expand upon cumulative impact because that's been set out quite clearly in the representation. You don't have a zone, it doesn't matter. It's a principle that you can take into account. You're very well aware of that. I again commend to you the test that you use, which is all about preventing things before they go wrong, because when things go wrong, typically they're not good. They're pretty serious. So unless either I or Ms. Kelsall can answer any questions for you, those are the points that I would wish to make. Thank you.
Hidden it away. You mentioned on a couple of occasions capacity issues, and that your company had also increased its capacity issues within relation to the operation there. Can you clarify, are you able to clarify those capacity issues for your operations at the present time, please?
So it was actually Fever that did the refurb on it, but from what I've been told from my deputy that worked for Fever before it became Stonegate, they extended the main room, so they pushed it back further. So that VIP entrance and exit, which we now use, wasn't there before when Velvet used to operate. They put that in to help with capacity. So when we had the fire officer out, obviously they did the our new capacity, which is now 974.
Thank you for that. And the other point you mentioned, that you'd now opened up a smoking operation on the roof. Is there a terrace there of some sort, or is it enclosed, just for clarification?
So it's all on one floor. So it's on the first floor, Fever is, and off the main room is sort of like a square area where they cut out the roof, and it's got like a netting on it to house people that are smoking. But it's also on our licence that we're not allowed to play music out there, and we have to have a double door system on to stop noise because of the issues with having an outside area.
Thank you. That's just what I wanted to clarify. Thank you. Sorry, did officers want to make any comments at this point in relation to what we've heard so far?
There you go, thank you. I mean, I've just looked at some of the complaints we've had about the nightclubs over the last few years, since about 2017. And for the premises, generally, most of them have been internal complaints. We've had very few actual complaints outside the vicinity of the premises, but because there will be obviously 2 premises there. That may change. But certainly we've had several complaints about accidents at the premises, which we've investigated. And also we did have problems with the smoking at the premises, and I believe pollution actually served notice rather than was done voluntarily, I seem to remember. But I may be wrong on that. But certainly some of the works that we were undertaking for the smoking area, we certainly were involved in.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Richardson. Thank you for that. Had you completed your statement? Do appreciate you taking the time to come along today and to update us to your concerns. Thank you for that. Mr. Woods, you've heard from the objector now. Either yourself or Mr. Elias wish to ask any further questions or pick up on any points that have been raised, or we want to expand and clarify anything. Now's your opportunity.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I don't want to ask any questions of Stonegate. Just looking at the procedure, I would like to make some final submissions, particularly based on what's been said. I don't know if we're at that stage and you're going to invite Ms. Clover to have a closing submission on top of what's been said before that. But all I have left to do is make my final submissions, which obviously will be the last thing you'll hear. So I don't know whether you want to invite any closing submissions first.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. Are there any outstanding submissions then first before we get to the closing statements? Mr. Richardson, can you just clarify, is that the next phase that we go through at this point?
Yes, Chair. If you look on page 9 of the agenda, you'll see that we're at the point now where clearly, if there are no questions, I think we're going over the page. We've had the interested party outline the case and call evidence. There are no responsible authorities, so now we're at the point where the interested parties should have the opportunity of making representations to the subcommittee. I would take that as closing submissions, and then the applicant would then get the final say on the matter, which would be Mr. Wood. So I don't know whether Ms. Clover wishes to wrap up, or whether she's just happy to take closing submissions from the applicant at this stage.
Sorry.
Chair, I don't have anything additional to add to what I've said. I made quite fulsome submissions, and I commend all of those to you, but I don't have anything else to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So we're back to you, Mr. Woods, or Mr. Elias, for your final submissions and wrapping up.
Thank you, Chair.
We'll go into consideration.
Thank you. What, of course, this case is not about is Stonegate against Epic. And I tried in my submissions to deal with the concerns that have been expressed in the Stonegate representations. Whether or not I have a view as to why the representation is made is irrelevant. And as you pointed out, Chair, we have a valid representation before the committee. It raises concerns that need to be dealt with by the applicant. So in making my submissions to you earlier, I had a list of all of the concerns, and I dealt with those concerns by way of my submissions. So it's not about Stonegate against Epic, but equally the Licensing Act, the Section 182 guidance, and your policy, as far as I can see, doesn't say that Stonegate have to be confident with an application, that Stonegate have to be happy with everything. What it does say is that as the committee, you make a decision as to whether you are happy that the licensing objectives are promoted by this application, and the guidance invites you, in particular with reference to crime and disorder, to look to your police force to see if they are happy that the applicant promotes the licensing objectives, and the same could equally be said with regard to the environmental health officer. And there is, of course, what can't just be considered is what is pure speculation about what may or may not happen. It's quite clear that you can't make a decision just based on that. But having said that, what I hope is that you are entirely satisfied, based on the submissions that I have made to you, that this application promotes the licensing objectives. In terms of some of the points made by Ms Clover on behalf of Stonegate, a question in whether the concerns have been dealt with, on behalf of Mr Elias, I gave an answer to every point that was raised in the Stonegate representation. And of course, whenever you open new premises, there are bound to be, and it will be the same with Stonegate, one or two issues that you need to resolve when you actually get to the premises themselves. And that is perfectly normal for the operational manual to be finalised after the building has been built, after Mr Elias has staff in there, and when he speaks to the police and gets them down. And it's not right to say that wouldn't be normal. Whilst I'm trying desperately not to get into epic against Stonegate, it's been said to you that Mr Elias or his management team walk away from premises. That clearly is said with intent for a particular reason. I've discussed this with Mr Elias and with other directors who've been in the industry for many years. You are aware, because we told you, that we sold premises to Stonegate in 2019. We have sold 3 or 4 other premises in our 20-year history of trading. We've sold them because it wasn't working out as we anticipated, it didn't fit the model, whatever the reason. But my instructions are absolutely clear that we have never walked away from premises in a way that is suggested to give the committee concerns that we will hear. We are signing and committing to a significant lease on these premises and are wholly committed to this venture in Nuneaton as we are in other towns. There was a slight misunderstanding as well, which Lauren very openly corrected, with regard to the VIP entrance and the changing of the rooms. When Lauren said Fever did that, she means Mr Elias when he was operating Fever, and it's very fair of Lauren to say. I was going to point that out, but Lauren very fairly said that. Mr Elias changed the rooms around in the first floor. Mr Elias put the VIP entrance on the premises to allow for extra capacity to go in because of the rooms, and fully understands the significance of that VIP entrance. Mr Elias also moved the smoking area from the back to the first floor where, and I haven't been in, but I think it is still on the first floor because it wasn't working at the back of the premises. In terms of queues, Ms Clover refers to queues and how you keep gaps. That's perfectly standard late night operations. If the committee would like a condition that any queues at the Trilogy premises do not block entrances or exits, then we are more than happy that that is a condition on the licence. But as you will know, it's legislation in any event, and the fire escapes. If Mr Elias doesn't do it, he'll be in the Warwickshire Justice Centre across the road and be prosecuted for it. But more importantly, he'd never do that. So that's perfectly standard and something that you can do by snaking people round in queues, but the entrances and exits at all times will be kept clear. Trying again not to make it epic against Stonegate, I think it is unfair, and I'll say no more than that, for a national operator as Stonegate is, with over 4,000 premises, to say to this committee that perhaps there was no police representation because Mr. Oakley is new to the job and may not understand the position. I think that is unfair on Warwickshire Police and does a disservice to them. Warwickshire Police will have considered this application as you will have expected them to do so. And I did liaise with Peter following the Stonegate rep. I sent it to them and said, here's these issues that I wasn't hiding from these issues. Here they are. Do we need to discuss anything? And we agreed the extra 4 conditions with Peter. Insofar as tension in the rooms, that to me is just another example of trying to suggest to the committee that something might go wrong that just isn't there. Mr. Elias has operated, as Stonegate do, many premises where there are twin rooms in there. And I don't think Stonegate are saying, can possibly be saying that that is an issue. In any event, it's not an issue for us. So I think those are the main points, and of course we will work together in ensuring that these premises run correctly if you're kind enough to grant the licence. I think I do have to say, and this is the last time I'll say I'm not making it Stonegate against it. When Stonegate bought our bars, there was a 12-week due diligence on all of the bars, on all of the policies, on all of our operational manuals, and the result of that was Stonegate bought our 32 premises. I don't think there was any concerns that had been expressed at that stage, and in buying those premises, described Mr. Elias's premises as an excellent fit with focus on quality. The position has changed as we now seek to open premises nearby. And the managing director and chief exec of Stonegate, when Mr. Elias worked with them, were very complimentary about Mr. Elias as well. So in terms of your decision, you will have it all in the papers. You will receive appropriate advice from officers. Your decision is based on the Licensing Act. Is this application promoting the licensing objectives? You will apply to the Section 182 guidance, which specifically invites you to consider what the police think about this application in terms of crime and disorder. And along the same lines, I would invite you to consider the same position with regard to the environmental health officer. You consider each application on its merits and make a finding of fact based on submissions and evidence that you've been given. And almost on one side, sometimes when you're making these decisions, you have one side saying we think this might happen, another side saying this will happen, whether it's the police and Stonegate or whether it's us and the fire officer. That's the nature of these proceedings. In this particular case, you have one argument expressing some concerns, and you have another argument saying that this unit has had 3 licenses in for many years, that they've run with those 3 licenses without issues, that none of the concerns that have been expressed came to fruition, and that this 3 premises can run quite properly, and then the nighttime economy can begin to thrive again with the license there. So you have actual evidence of it happening and it working. And on top of that, you have no submissions from the police, no statistics, nothing from environmental health, and nothing from from anybody else, which I would ask you to attach great weight to. And I have to say, and I'm almost done. In terms of the final submissions that Stonegate make, which isn't necessarily don't grant the licence, but look at capacity, look at hours, look at last entry time, those are the three things that would give Stonegate a huge commercial advantage if these premises trade next to each other. Knocking our capacity, knocking our hours, and knocking our last entry time. It is a huge commercial advantage. And I think, if I may say, that's one of the reasons why those concerns have been given to you. And I'd ask you to take note of that. But in conclusion, I hope it hasn't just been Epic and Stonegate. I think the concerns in the letter quite properly bring this matter before you. I hope you're happy that Mr. Elias has answered all of those questions. Of course, some of those answers will be determined when the dispersal policy is agreed with the police. But it's quite right that you can rely on the police to work with us, and of course we'll work with Stonegate in terms of finalising those policies, because that's what happened in the many years that the building had 3 licences. It's what happened when Mr. Elias worked in Nuneaton previously, meeting with Carleen Sims monthly, moving the smoking area from the back, increasing the rooms inside, but adding another entrance on to make sure that there was an entrance from a safety and a VIP entrance point of view. And on the back of all of that trading, so Mr. Elias did all of that when he was operating the premises, I would invite you to be completely satisfied that this application promotes the licensing objectives as applied for, with the hours that Mr. Elias has applied for, and that if there are other measures, as your policy says, other conditions that you think are appropriate, such as the queue business, but Mr. Elias has to do that in any event, then of course that is a matter for you. But I would invite you to grant the application satisfied, as your police force and environmental health officers are, that this application promotes the objectives on the hours that it is applied for. You of course know that there are proceedings the enforcement proceedings which could be brought against anybody moving forward, but we are confident, as we are when we operated in Nuneaton for 8 years previously, that what we are putting here will work as it did previously, and we would ask you to grant the application. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Woods, Mr. Elias. Ms. Kelsall, Ms. Clover, appreciate your submissions. Thank you, everyone. It's now for the committee to decide. We'll go into consideration of that at this point, and I'll have to ask you to leave whilst we go. Do we move out, or do they move out, which is easier?
It's entirely up to you, Chair. The only thing I would say is, whichever you decide, we must, if you're going to do it in here, we need to pause the live stream.
That's what I was thinking. Should we move out? Yeah.
Committee room D is free, Chair.
Committee room D. Right. The committee will retire to consider that. Would ask officers to come through in a few moments, please, just for some legal advice, maybe, if necessary. That includes the licensing officer as well. I think that's probably appropriate. Okay, we'll adjourn the meeting for a short time, and then we'll return to give our consideration. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Richardson. First of all, I'd like to thank both parties for their presentations, representations today. We have considered this matter carefully, and in consideration, the committee believes and are minded to grant the licence as requested, along with the conditions set out that you've already submitted. Obviously, it will be down for you to then liaise with the licensing department to get those into place. Is there anything else?
No.
Mr. Richardson. As I say, thank you once again for your attendance, and that's our decision for today. Thank you.
Shall we stop the
If you could close the live streaming now, please. That concludes the meeting for today. Thank you.